Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content. We have officially closed out the western portion of our off-season breakdown, so I think we deserve a round of applause for that. It's been a marathon. And this is technically the first episode of the eastern portion. And I know we said we're going to condense the format of the episode and do two teams, but for this specific episode, we're going to start the East off with one, but going forward, it will be two, just because of time concerns and all that. But before we announce our first team, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and X at the OBT Podcast for updates. And now to unveil our team, it is the Detroit Pistons. So I think we chose to start with this team because I think they did a decent amount this offseason, whether it be in the draft and all that. But at the same time, they did finish pretty horribly last season. They finished with a 17-65 record. Pretty bad if you ask me. So I think this is the worst record in the entire league, if I'm not mistaken. So like I said, they finished bottom of the East and bottom of the league in general. Missed out on the number one pick, surprisingly. So that is a huge loss for them in the draft, but they did make up for it in general. But season-wise, there's not really much to say, except for the fact that they kind of stunk up the joint from day one, really. But, there were some injuries. But I guess we should really talk about their roster. I think that's the main thing that we should be talking about because, like I said, the storyline, there isn't really much there because, they were just a bad team. But in general, let's look at this roster. I think this is a very young, promising, and definitely skilled roster for sure. So starting off, we've got Bojan Bogdanovic. Probably butchered his first name, but in general, Bojan. Sorry for all the Bojan fans, but in general, I think this is a good player to have on the roster. Joe Harris, interesting signing as well. Both shooters, so I think this is something that you want to do when you have somebody like Cade Cunningham, Jaden Ivey, guys who aren't, necessarily the strongest shooters, but, have immense upside at that point guard and shooting guard position. Then moving down the line, you got Marvin Bagley, the third. This guy's interesting. I think, he's had an up and down career. I think he was more so coveted as like a very talented prospect coming out of college, but kind of moving into the NBA, he didn't necessarily transition all that well, though he has turned it around, and I think he has some promising years left in Detroit. James Wiseman, kind of similar story, very highly respected prospect coming out of college. There were questions about it, but, eventually he kind of just fell out of rotation in Golden State, injuries and whatnot, but he did land in Detroit as well. So this is kind of a trend. They seem to be very heavy at certain positions, and they're very young. That's the thing. I think that's the narrative with this team is that they're super young. Like I said, moving down, we got Cade Cunningham, another young guy. Definitely a generational talent, in my opinion. I think he has the potential to be at least. So, not really much to say. I mean, he's young, but I think we're expecting him to take another leap as he's continuously done. Main question is, can he stay healthy? Alec Burks, veteran, not much to say there, three-point shooter. So it's interesting to see that they are surrounding their young guys and their young talent with some shooters. Monte Morris, I'm not a huge fan. That may be the Wizards' bias, but I do respect his years in Denver. I think he did step up when Jamal Murray was out and hurt, but for me, I just don't know if he can control a pace, but, I'm sure he'll have a good role, I guess, in terms of the rotation and where he is, in terms of this Detroit team. I just don't think he was a good fit for the Wizards. So can't be too mad at it. Then one of my personal favorites on this team, Ausar Thompson. This guy is the next big thing. It seems like he's like, NBA ready for sure. He plays defense, but his offense is there as well. Jump shot may be a little bit broken, fundamentally, but, it gets the job done. He can slash, plays defense, and it seems like he's, Detroit, they got a good one in the draft with this guy. Jaden Ivey, this one's interesting. I think, people have kind of labeled him as the budget Ja Morant, but at this point, I don't know what to really make of him. The shot doesn't seem like it's there, but the immense downhill speed, the playmaking ability, it's all there. And like I said, I think this team is really strong in terms of their shooting because, like I said, the youth, when you have young athletic guys, you do want to surround them with kind of older shooters. So I think that's a smart move to keep him on the roster as well. Not much you can really do because I'm pretty sure he's still on a rookie contract. Moving down the line, Killian Hayes. This one's a rough one. I might have to bite the bullet on this one. I said this guy may have a chance at being good, but as of right now, it hasn't really looked too hot for him. It's been years on years, and they keep drafting point guards and players that can facilitate a little bit better than him. So he might fall out of the rotation completely. Isaiah Stewart, this one's a big one. He's their center as well. So, like I said, they have a bunch of centers. So they have James Wiseman, Isaiah Stewart, and then Jalen Duren as well. So this is an interesting roster, in my opinion. And I've liked what they've done this offseason. I'll probably let you talk about what they've done specifically this offseason. But in general, I'm not too mad at this roster, and I really like it.
Yeah, I mean, because again, like you said, you got to start off with the backcourt, right? Obviously, Cade and Jaden Ivey, right? Those are
Yeah,
both guards that can create for themselves and for others. Off the dribble. The main issue is it's not a great shooting backcourt.
right.
With Cade, the issue for him, like you mentioned, has been can he stay on the floor? Right? Last season, he only played in 12 games. Averaged just under 20 a game, 6 rebounds, 6 assists, right? 28 from three,
Yeah,
42 from the field. So that's not amazing,
right.
obviously. But again, he's still very young. He's just 21. He's going to be 22, I think, once the season starts. Um, right. Ivy, similar thing, 16 a game, 5 assists, 4 rebounds, 34 from three, which is, better. And then 42 from the field. Um, but then you kind of like, again, you get into the guys that they drafted, right? Asor Thompson, right? That's the guy that you mentioned, right? The twin brother of Amon Thompson, right?
Yeah,
For Houston, right? Like you said, his brother is more of like a point guard, whereas he's more of like a guard wing, right? 2-3 that can do a lot of other things
yeah,
as well, in addition to kind of being able to play make.
sure.
Um, they also took Marcus Sasser, which I believe initially was a Boston pick that was traded over there, right? Just like another guard, another young guard to add to the roster. Kind of like you mentioned, right? Killian Hayes was a guy that they had drafted in the lottery and just hasn't panned out.
Yeah. And they've continuously
Just
drafted point guard talent, so that tells
yeah,
me, there's room to be made, I think, on this roster.
right. And then, like you mentioned, the other, intriguing part of the roster is just the fact that you have so many bigs. Because as you mentioned, right, Marvin Bagley, Jalen Duren, James Wiseman, and Isaiah Stewart, right? All these guys are kind of, you know, mainly fives, right? I guess Bagley was drafted as a four, right? But
Right.
it's 9, 6'10" or whatever.
Yeah. I,
He's
I
kind of
consider him a center pretty much at this
right.
point.
But at the same time, that's kind of like why in the offseason they went out and got some guys that can shoot, because like you mentioned, right, they traded for Joe Harris, right, and just kind of like I think absorbed his contract basically, like
Yeah.
as and then just gave up a second, I think.
Yeah.
They traded for Monte Morris, right, who's kind of like another guard that's a decent shooter for the point guard spot.
Right.
So they have a lot of guards and a lot of bigs. But having more shooters, I think, kind of will help facilitate having, a lot of those bigs around, right? Because we saw in the summer league, because when we watched Detroit play, we saw combinations where they had both Jalen Duren and James Wiseman together, right?
And we were looking at each other like, huh? But
Yeah, it
then
was
once it started, it was like, okay.
right, because like with Duren, it seemed like he's kind of improved in some ways, like with the ball in his hands, which it didn't really feel like he kind of had to do. But
Right.
coming in, it seemed like he was mainly just like a pick and roll lob threat. But he's kind
Sure.
of expanded his game. In terms of what we saw in the summer league, right, shooting the basketball, right, some ball handling, playmaking
Yes.
capabilities. And again, like that's fine. To work on aspects of your game that weren't really there before. If they are going to be a legitimate part of his game. It's
Right.
so it's kind of cool to see him shake things up and add some parts to his game that I don't really think people would have sort of asked him to do. But again, in order to make those type of fits work, right? Like you can't have those two guys together, then neither of them can space the floor.
Exactly. Even
So
Wiseman was hitting threes too in the summer league
yeah,
game, which was
yeah.
surprising.
So right, and then Bagley can kind of do some things.
Hmm.
Stewart, has kind of added to his offensive game, right, where he can kind of shoot threes a little bit better now.
Sure.
So they have a lot. They have a intriguing mix of, like you mentioned, young players, with some vets, right, that can shoot the ball because they did not really have a lot of 3-point shooting last year,
Hmm.
and they tried to experiment with the two big combos last year, right, at times, and and then it didn't just affect the bigs, it also even affected the guards, right, like
Right.
Jake Ivey, he's got the ball in his hands, mostly without Cade Cunningham, right, and his two bigs are Wiseman and Duren. Neither guy was really spacing the floor like that for
Yeah.
them. That's kind of rough, for a guy like Ivy who also wants to try to get to the basket. So I
Yeah.
mean, you
It's
kind of
tough.
right. So you kind of have to, deal with the slotting. Um, One aspect that we didn't really mention was that was part of their offseason was they also hired a new coach, right?
You're right.
Excuse me, they hired Monty Williams.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, that completely slipped my mind. You're absolutely correct. It's a
Right from the
historic
Phoenix,
signing too.
yeah, from the Phoenix Suns, right prior to the Spurs extending Greg Popovich, right? Monty Williams, got like the biggest coach contract right in history, right? Basically a contract that depending on incentives and whatnot, could be up to $100 million. So I mean, I think by default, I think it was about 6 years and 80. So
That's
he's
crazy,
a
man.
yeah, so he's a guy that has been part of rebuilds, right? Because he was there, for a big chunk of the Suns rebuild, right? He was there, the year that the Suns were in the bubble, and you could kind of see that some of the talent was there, right? But they weren't a great team, and then obviously
Sure.
the following year, right, they went to the finals. Um, so, we know that he's got it, he's got a pretty solid resume, with young talent.
Yeah.
And it'll be interesting to see what he does, in Detroit. Obviously, the expectations aren't the same as they were in Phoenix because nobody's expecting, Detroit to come in and win a bunch of games off, right out of the gates.
No, or
But
be a playoff team, I don't think.
right, exactly. But it will be kind of, it will be something to look for, in terms of like, can he get guys to buy in, how does he utilize a lot of the pieces that he has on this roster? Because again, like you mentioned, there's a lot to like about the roster. Because
For
again, you
sure.
have multiple guys who are really versatile, with your guards like Cunningham and Ivy. You got guys like Bogdanovich and Joe Harris who are capable of hitting jump shots.
Yeah.
Again, you have bigs that also, have athleticism and can do a number of things. It's just a matter of can they get all these parts to come together, and that can
That's the
kind of change.
question.
Yeah, exactly, and that's the question, and that can kind of like determine what the ceiling of this team is, right? Because I think most people in general, um, expect this team to not really be, a playoff or maybe compete maybe for the last play-in spot, but that might be kind of like a ceiling best case scenario
Yeah. I
situation, right?
agree.
It's more likely that they'll probably miss, the play in again. But I guess if you're looking for progress, right, you would expect them to win more than 17 games, especially if, you can get good health from your main guys, right? Because they did have guys miss time, including Cade, right, who was their best player, right? It's hard to, you know, really compete for games when your best player misses all but like, 10 games.
Right.
So that's kind of a big part there, which we already mentioned with the help. But outside of that, like you mentioned, I liked a lot of what they did this offseason. They were another one of those teams that, had cap space, but they ended up not signing any free agents. They just traded in, they brought in vets through trade. And, you can't be mad at that, right? Because, like,
Small market team too.
right, exactly, right? Because we know that, like, Joe Harris and Monte Morris, right? Like, Joe Harris, in the postseason hasn't really been able to do a whole lot, compared to
Sure.
what he does in the regular season. But this is not really a playoff team, right? So you'd
Right.
expect in the regular season he should be able to win you a decent number of games, assuming his 3-point shot is there and he can stay healthy, right? Because
Right.
he's had some issues, staying on the floor, right? Bogdanovich had a really good season last year, right? We talked about him. It felt like seemingly like every other podcast, right? Because we were trying to figure out, whether or not he was going to get moved,
Yeah.
to, some veteran team, right? He averaged over 20 a game, 4 rebounds, 2.5 assists, right? 49 from the field, 41 from three. So pretty much his best season as a pro, essentially. On a team that I guess, in fairness, didn't really have any real expectations. But again, he went in there and pretty much did his job. So, and they signed him to an extension. So you just kind of wonder, like, is he going to be there for the long term? Because that's the other thing is, with those guys that they traded for, that gives them some flexibility, right? Maybe at the deadline, maybe they can be like, hey, if you want one of these guys, you can come and get him, but you're going to have to give us, maybe some picks,
Right.
maybe another young player or something like that. Um, right. But you don't have to worry about that until you get closer to the deadline, right? For now, like it's completely fine to have the vets on the roster, to kind of show the young guys, what to do, right? We
Absolutely.
mentioned that with Houston where, they didn't really have like a lot of vets like that last year. And it seemed like a really rough situation for Houston for most of last year.
Yeah, I
So,
agree.
yeah. So, like you said, I like a lot of what they did this offseason. It just comes down to can all these pieces fit together? Because, even though there is a lot to like about the roster, there also are just some weird aspects of it. Because like we mentioned, having that many bigs, right, that are all probably going to have to play, right? That's an interesting situation to be in,
There is
right?
such a thing as like too much depth.
Right. Yeah.
That
So,
can be a problem.
right. Yeah. It's just, again, with Detroit, because you're in the midst of a rebuild, you're kind of right now just trying to see, like, who's good, who can stick around,
Exactly.
and that's the main thing, right? Like, the goal right now is to facilitate the development of the young guys. The veterans are obviously there to help as well.
Yeah.
and obviously contribute in ways that they can. But, for right now, you're kind of just evaluating, the talent that you have and seeing maybe, you can get a random guy to develop on the roster, right? Maybe Killian Hayes finally figures it out, right? And then
Who
all of a sudden,
knows?
yeah, like, and all of a sudden maybe he's, an intriguing candidate, for some other team, right? Because,
Right.
again, like if you're building around Ivy and Cunningham, you
You
probably
don't
don't need,
need Hayes.
although, with Cunningham's size, right, maybe you could experiment with some three guard lineups, and maybe, kind of see what you got there, right?
Yeah.
Because you expect with Cunningham's size, he should be a guy that,
Could
maybe
play the
can spend
three.
some time. Yeah, can play the three like in smaller lineups, right?
Sure.
You don't want him doing it all the time, but
Right.
it's certainly something to think about, right? So, and again, like I mentioned, you have other guys, right? Like Monte Morris, right? He could fit in those three guard lineups and kind of just be out there as like a 3-point shooter,
Mm-hmm.
or somebody else like that, or right, Alec Burks, right? You could put him out there, in these small ball lineups, right? So they'll have a lot of options, but
They are
again,
lacking at that wing spot though.
right, exactly. Because, that's the main thing right now. It's really Bogdanovich, Asor Thompson, who's more like a 2-3, I guess, than he is like a, pure wing, I
Yeah,
think.
he's more of a two. I think his primary position is probably a two, but he can play the three for sure.
And then you have Joe Harris, who I guess is like another kind of 2
That's a
3.
two. That's a
Yeah.
two in my opinion.
Because, like, I know for Brooklyn, he played a lot like at the small forward spot, but that's because, they had Harden and Kyrie,
Exactly. And look how
which
that worked out. So
yes. Yeah, so, I mean, that's yeah, like you said, the wing position is kinda bizarre, but it makes sense, right? Because if you have a ton of guards and a ton of bigs, then you're not gonna have that many options at the
right.
wing. And then again, if you move Bogdanovich, right, then that wing depth gets even, more shaky. So,
Yeah. Then you only
you know
have like what, Isaiah Livers, I think.
yeah, it's Livers, and then other guys who are kinda masquerading as wings, like you
Right.
mentioned, like Sor or Alec Burks, right? Who, these are guys that will probably play the 3 a lot, but they're not really, they're not really
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
now. So that's kind of how I look at that. So you do have a lot of size, you do have a lot of athletes, so that should make you, formidable on the glass, right?
Sure.
You have some guys that can create. You do have some good shooters. You do have some vets, but again, I do kind of worry about that wing, you depth. And then, at the same time, you got some guys that are probably going to miss a lot of time. And it's just a very young team, right? With a new coach. So it's probably going to be kind of rough to start. But, over the course of the season, it should probably get better, once they kind of figure out what they have and how to best utilize a lot of these players.
I agree. To kind of like lean on that. I don't know, like what are we thinking expectation wise? I know we kind of talked about it briefly, but like for me, let's just look at like where they finished. Finished dead last, 17-65. So I think they'll be light years ahead of 17 games won. I think they'll probably be in a similar spot to Orlando and where they finished, which is around like that 34-48 mark. But I don't know. That could be a long shot. Maybe it's more closer to like, Charlotte where it's like 10 more games won. But I don't know. I just feel like they've gotten so much better and, praying that their health works out. I think they're still not going to be like a top 10 team in the East, but I
Oh,
think, they'll be light years ahead of where they were, last
yeah.
season.
Looks like, some of the over-unders have them around 28.5. So that's a little more than 10 wins, more than what they had last season. So I think they should be somewhere around that. Like you said, somewhere probably like, like you said, either close to 30 or, somewhere maybe slightly over. But again, like much more than that, that's gonna probably put you closer to, the play-in spot, once you start getting like to 35, plus wins.
Yeah.
So, and I think, like I said, some of that is going to be dependent on the progress of some of these guys, right? Because if Cade, like you said, comes out and all of a sudden in year 3, looks great, right? And he's all of a sudden like, maybe he's in talks as like, oh, he could be an all star, or oh, maybe he could
Right.
be like, most improved or something like that, right? Then that kind of changes, how good they might be, right? And then obviously one of the other guys, right? If Ivy, makes significant progress in his second season, or one of the bigs, or if Asor Thompson has a great rookie year, right? Like that can kind of change, the projections of how well they do. But regardless, like I said, I think the ceiling is probably, like you mentioned, like somewhere around 34, wins or something like that,
Right.
right? Just outside of the play-in, like best case scenario, maybe they could get up to like 11 or 12. But, again, there could also just be another scenario where, they could be 10, 12 wins better, but then still probably be closer to like, you know, 14th or something like that.
Right.
The East is different than the West because it's not
Very.
as So that's kind of also something to consider as well, right? You have a couple of teams where it's like, they could be like, one weird situation away from all of a sudden, like, dropping, compared to where they were the year before. So,
Yeah,
yeah, the Eastern Conference, I think there's obviously like, it's not as deep as the Western Conference, but there's some teams that I do think in the East could potentially make a jump, and this could be one of them,
they're
but not a
solid
jump
candidates.
team. Like just a jump as to like, yeah, they're a team that I think, people should be keeping an eye on, as like,
Sure,
like people sometimes use the term like league pass team.
I get
This
you.
could be one of those teams, depending on how things pan out.
Yeah, and
But
it's like
overall, I like what they did.
yeah, and it's like I'm looking around. Like I guess we should talk about like teams that they could potentially be better than this season. I guess coming up, and it's
Mhm.
like I feel like Charlotte, if healthy, is probably better than Detroit.
And that's
Because
yeah,
and that's something we've talked about. Like I'm sure that was what you were gonna say. We think that Charlotte is better on paper than they are when it comes to actually playing. So
is
that's
that a hot
intriguing.
take?
I feel like it is, but that just
Okay,
might be like I don't know. That might just be the way that we watch the Hornets or something. I don't know. But to
yeah,
me, like when I look at the Hornets, I don't think necessarily that's a horrible team. I think it was more so of a horribly managed team. That's kind of the way that I look at it. But then moving on, like I don't think they're better than Orlando. I think they
right.
have potential to be better than Washington.
Mhm.
I don't think they're better than Indiana. So it's like I don't really see them taking like
You're right.
like the jump where they're like I said a top 10 team or even really like a top 12. Like I
Yeah,
feel like they're going to be stuck in like that 13, 14
yeah.
range.
I
I
think
don't know.
I think this is another one of these teams where they'll win more games, but the standings wise, it probably won't change too much. I think they'll
Exactly.
be better than 15th, right? Because
Sure.
I think a team probably like Washington will probably be closer, down to that bottom spot.
Yeah.
But you just never know. So, but like I said, I think, I guess now we can kind of get into, what grade would you give them in the offseason? We kind of like in a way sort of hinted at the idea of that we liked,
Yeah.
most of what they did, but I guess now we might as well just give out our official grades.
Sure. Yeah, I'm gonna give them a A. I'm gonna start off very strong. I think they had a great offseason in the draft. I thought they did stellar. Obviously drafting one of the Thompson twins, Sora that is. And then acquiring Joe Harris, I think that was a great move as well. Obviously the coaching change, huge deal. I think Monty Williams is a great coach. I think he will make a huge difference in terms of culture. It's gonna be a culture shock, and I think everybody's gonna be on board with that. And then obviously the big one, Isaiah Stewart. I think that extension was a great, move. I think it's like one where you can keep him around on a really like good, solid steel budget contract, but it's also movable if you feel confident in, say Jalen Duren or, James Wiseman or even Marvin Bagley. Like if you feel like you can move on from Isaiah Stewart, then I think they've given themselves the leeway to do that. So I think they've constructed a good roster going into the next season. I'm just not sure how sustainable it's going to be moving down the line. But for this offseason, absolute A, because I think they are leaps and bounds from where they were last season.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty much on board with you. I think like you said, I would give them pretty much, like A minus pretty much because like you said, I think, the Thompson pick, right, kind of falling to them because I think that was kind of looked at as a surprise,
Yes.
right? Well, I mean, I guess yeah, kind of, right? Because I
Yeah,
think he was
because
expected to go
before the draft, he was lower. They had him projected around like 8, 9, but then he
right.
rose up, and then what's his name? Cam Whitmore fell. That's what
Yeah,
happened.
yeah, my bad. So I misspoke. I meant like, yeah, they took him higher than what was expected,
Yes.
but most people agreed that that was a really good pick. Just because, again, like you said, there's a lot of potential. There's a lot to like about, his all around game, kind of, with his athleticism. Like you mentioned, we'll see with Sasser, but I think the Thompson pick is the main thing that's really good. Like you mentioned, the acquisitions of guys like Joe Harris and Monte Morris for basically nothing, right?
Yeah.
So you add extra talent, right? Vets, guys that can shoot. That was a big weakness for them last year. So I think that's something that they did a much better job of improving. Like you mentioned, the Isaiah Stewart extension is good because again, it allows you to keep him for now. And then, like you said, if he pans out and he's better than you think, right, then that's a guy on a solid contract. And if it doesn't work, that's a tradable contract. And again, they've left themselves a lot of flexibility to move some other guys, right? For other guys, regardless of what happens, like a Bogdanovich or Alec Burks. So, like you said, I think overall, yeah, that's pretty much an A. I think they had about as good of an offseason as you could have expected from them. And then, like you mentioned, the coach, right? Like they got Monty Williams, they got the guy that was the guy they wanted. They did have to pay a lot, but again, it doesn't matter how much you give them because there's no salary cap or any like negative consequences for paying for coaches. And I
Right.
think probably, and I think he's definitely an upgrade over Dwayne Casey,
Oh,
who,
light
yeah,
years.
like, in Toronto did a fine job, right? But just hasn't really been able to do much since then. So, I think he's been elevated to a front office role, which is fine. So, yeah, I think, like you said, I think Detroit had a really good offseason. And, again, if I was a Detroit fan, even though you didn't get Wembanyama,
That
right,
was the big. That
that's
stings.
the rough part. Like, you didn't get Victor Wembanyama, but I think they still had a really good offseason, like, considering that, like, again, it started off close to as bad as you could get because not only did they not get the number one pick, even though they had the worst record, right, they dropped. They dropped, all the
Yeah.
way down to, like, what was it, 4 or 5 or whatever.
Yeah,
So,
I think it was five.
yeah,
I think it was five.
yeah, exactly. So that's pretty rough. So to kind of be able to make these other moves around the margins, and kind of, do some other things to help out, I think that's about as good as you could do given, some of the limitations. Because again, that's pretty rough, to not be able to say that you got Victor Wembanyama, right? Because if they did the other things that they did and got him, right, then that's like a home run, right?
That's
Like
like an
that's
S tier. I think we would have to give them an S grade or
yeah,
like E
yeah.
for excellent, something other than A.
Exactly, right? But, you didn't get him. You couldn't you also couldn't get Scoot, which, you probably don't need, but I mean, obviously you're not drafting based off of need at this point because,
Right.
you're one of the worst teams in the NBA. But again, I still think Thompson will be a really good player, and I like the other pieces around them and what they did. So, yeah, I
Yes.
think I pretty much give them, like you said, an A, A minus in that realm. I think they had a really good offseason. And I think, overall, the Detroit front office has done a pretty solid job, as of late the last, couple of seasons, right? Whereas like, for a while it seemed like they were like kind of like a, annually like inept franchise for a while
Sure.
where it seemed like that they made a lot of really bizarre decisions.
I agree.
But I think now they've definitely gotten back on track. And I think that, they got some really good years ahead of them.
Yeah, it should be really fun to watch. And like I said, um, I think this roster is likable. I think, I think there's a lot of hope for this one, in terms of, being better, not necessarily, like we said, to go into the playoffs or anything. But I think
Right.
this offseason they have addressed every need that they possibly could have. And like you said, they got a lot of hybrid players. So I guess, the concern isn't really so much the wing, it's just more so who is really going to actually be there because there's so many hybrid guys. So I'm
So
curious
I
to see their rotations.
Yeah, and I guess kinda to, like, put a bow on the Detroit,
Yeah.
talk, I guess, which of their young guys, do you expect to, like, kinda break out, right? Like,
Mm,
of the guys that were already on the roster,
sure.
right, which of their young guys do you think will take, like, the biggest step forward, right? Obviously, outside of, like, say, like, a Cade
Right.
or something like that, you know what I mean?
Yeah, like my instinct is telling me to go with Jaden Ivey, but
Okay,
my heart is really telling me to go with Jalen Duren.
okay.
Because I think what we saw in the summer league. I'm telling you, we were kind of baffled. We were really
Yeah,
bamboozled. We were like, we didn't know, we weren't familiar with this part of your game, buddy. It's kind
yeah.
of one of those deals. But like with Jaden Ivey, I wasn't too impressed in the summer league, and I know that's you got to take the summer league with a grain of salt sometimes, but I think from what I've seen in terms of offseason improvement, I'm gonna go with Jalen Duren. I think he might be a force to reckon with. Not like crazy talent, but I think he might, have a breakout season, like you said. I think he's more likely to break out than Jaden
Yeah.
Ivey.
Yeah, very high motor, right?
Hmm.
Does a lot of things pretty well, on the board, shot blocking, around the basket. And we
Yeah,
saw, in the summer league, he flashed a little bit of a handle, a little bit of a jump shot.
midi
So, if he can do some of those other things, right, it'll be, like you said, it'll be really interesting to
could be
look out
scary.
for. Yeah, exactly, for what he can do.
Yeah,
So, and again, like some of that is almost kind of out of necessity in order to make those, big pairings work. Because again,
right,
they have a lot of bigs that are probably going to have to spend a lot of time playing alongside one another. And none of them are like, natural, shooters or anything, right?
right.
Like Wiseman, Duran, Stewart, Bagley, they're all more comfortable, I think, around the basket.
None of these guys are stretch fives,
Yeah,
but the fact that they're adding to their bags is great, and I think Jalen Duren's showing that to
yeah,
us.
like we've seen guys like Wiseman and Bagley, and Stewart, like try to take outside shots, right? But they're much better, I think, around the basket.
I agree.
But again, they can't all be inside bigs because that just mucks
Messes
up
up
the
your
space.
spacing. Yep.
Yeah, it just messes up a lot for the guards, and it just makes it more difficult for them to do, what they do best, right? Which is, to be able to attack off the dribble.
Right.
So I guess, now, we might as well get into the news and rumors. So I guess the first thing we should probably talk about is we actually got a couple of free agency signings. So we got Christian Wood and Danny Green, right? So Christian Wood, right after, kind of like I guess at this point it's been like what, well over Bless
Excuse
you.
me.
I guess well
Thank you.
over a month or 2 or whatever, right?
Yeah,
And now, yeah, I guess since July, basically,
pretty
and
much.
now he's decided, right? So he signed a 2-year deal with the Los Angeles Lakers. The second year being a player option, right? And then Danny Green signed a 1-year deal with the Philadelphia 76ers. Both contracts are for the minimum. I don't think Green's contract, I guess, was like put out, but I'm gonna assume it's a minimum contract.
Probably.
No, Woods was because that one was reported. So I
Right.
guess we'll start with the Christian Wood signing.
Yeah.
Um, so we talked about it, right, initially when it was kinda suggested, like, because we know what happened last year, right, where he was in Dallas, they traded for him. Initially, it seemed like it was fine, he played well, the team was doing relatively well considering what the expectations were, and then the second half of the year, right, it just fell apart, right, then eventually he lost his spot in the rotation, lost
Uh,
his minutes, right, the
yeah.
team was losing, and then they just, decided not to bring him back. And when we were doing our free agency predictions, because we did a podcast episode about where we thought guys might go, we were having a hard time panning out where he was going to go. I think we kind of like just said almost on a whim, like, what about the Magic? But
Yes.
like even then, like we were like, we don't know. But of course, that kind of ended up being closer to reality because he ended up not getting signed at all, right? No team touched him. Um, and we had like a month plus long battle, right, in terms of like rumors about where was he gonna go, right? LA came up, Miami came up,
And I think
Chicago,
you should probably explain, like, our reasoning in terms of what it
right?
had to do with Lillard.
Yeah, exactly. And Miami, Chicago. So there was a lot of like, I don't want to know if conflicting information is the right word, but like at times it seemed like people were kind of like going back and forth on where they thought he was gonna go. Because at one point there were a lot of people that said, "Oh, he's probably gonna go to LA," right? Then we also heard at one point, well, Miami he might prefer to go to. He's just waiting on the Lillard situation, right? Where it's like, you know, what happens with the Lillard trade? Because if the Heat trade for Lillard, then that opens up roster spots, that opens up some opportunity. But then it depends on like what permutation of the Lillard trade it is, right? Because then
Right.
it's like, well, if they bring back Yusuf Nurkic, then they don't need Christian Wood because they would already have a center, right? And
Right.
if they didn't bring him back, then they'd be okay with it. Then it's like probably an upgrade over Thomas Bryant, who I think was the only other big that they signed.
Yeah.
Um, and then Chicago was another name that came up because they had that disabled player exception because
Yes.
Lonzo is going to be out for the season, so they could technically pay him the most. But then I think they used, but then I think they re-signed Ayo Dosunmu. So
Yes.
then, like, if they used most of that exception, it would have gotten them closer to the tax. And then, like, Chicago's not a team that historically does that, just because that's just not what the ownership does.
Right.
So eventually we were kind of waiting. So a lot of sources were saying a lot of different things. Um, I think we kind of expected that he would probably sign either with the Lakers or the Heat.
Yes.
I don't think
We
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 really
went with
thought.
the Lakers, I think.
Yeah, and I think we kind of like leaned towards the Lakers. I don't think either of us like said like thought that that was our first choice in terms of like who the Lakers should sign because I think there was like also a discussion of who should they get? Should it be like a Biyombo? Should it be
Right.
like a Tristan Thompson,
Right.
Christian Wood, bring it back Wenyan Gabriel or somebody else? Um, and I think like both of us at the time I think preferred some other bigs like I think we mentioned Biyombo just because defense, rebounding, physicality,
Yes.
but I did say that I do think that LA would be the best opportunity for him because it would give him the opportunity to go to a team that's got a legitimate chance to, contend for a title. Um, and then if he can show that he can, make an impact, towards winning on the Lakers, right, with guys like LeBron and AD, right, he's going to be able to cash, he's going to be able to cash out in the next offseason
Right. Get
if
his
he
value up.
right, because we know that the talent is there, right? We've talked about it multiple times where, we do like a lot of the things that he can do, mainly as an offensive player. Obviously defensively, right, not amazing, right, not great. But
Right.
the other issue I think was there were kind of like concerns about like, just in terms of him like having issues, I guess, in the locker room, right? Like, and there's always concerns about like, well, if this guy's so talented, why has he bounced around so much? But I do think that this is probably like the best opportunity for him. Because again,
Mhm.
if you can't, get things right, in a situation with like, LeBron and AD, right, where this is kind of like tailor made for you, right, where you're not asked to do like some of the things that he was doing like in Dallas and Houston, right? Like say in Dallas, he was their center, right? Pretty much
Right.
their only real source of, rim protection at times, other than like I guess like a Maxi Kleba, or like, Dwight Powell or Dorian Finney Smith, before he was traded. But now in LA, you get to play alongside, say, like AD, right? Obviously you can play alongside LeBron, right? Those are just different types of guys defensively
Sure.
than the guys he was playing with before. So, I think
Even
they're
in
better.
Houston, like he wasn't
Yeah,
really around any solid defenders.
right. So I think like, they're better equipped, to deal with whatever issues stem, from whatever, right? Than maybe his other stops.
Yeah, I
And
agree.
you're also not bound to him because it's a minimum contract. So if it doesn't work,
It's a
right, then
win-win.
yeah, exactly. So it's a win-win for both. Because again, if you're LA, you're banking on the talent, right, outweighing whatever issues that may arise. And if it pans out right, then you got a really good player for a minimum contract. So you can't really complain about that. Because like I said, he wasn't our first choice. But I don't think either of us were like under no circumstances should the Lakers,
Yeah,
consider.
we were for it, but you know,
Right.
there
It
were
wasn't
other
our.
candidates.
Yeah, because for me personally, as a Lakers fan, I just was like, yeah, I don't really know if he like necessarily brings like to the table what they really need. Like I know he can do certain things, but the things he can do, I don't really feel like LA really needs more of.
Right.
But at the same time, like I said, I was not against it. Like in the sense of like, hey, if they sign him, I'm not going to be like, oh, this is a disaster, this is terrible. Because like I
Right.
said, it's very rare that I would complain about a minimum contract signing. Especially again, it's the 14th guy on the roster. Reportedly he's probably going to be the main backup big, right? Which again, I'm fine with, right? Because I don't really want him starting alongside AD because I just think that's probably like too big of a lineup where you're going to have some issues, I think, defensively.
Yes, absolutely. Especially
I
on rotations. Good luck in guarding the PNR.
Right, yeah, and I don't mind him playing, like, the occasional minutes with AD or whatever, that's perfectly fine.
But starting,
Um,
no.
yeah, but starting, I don't know about that, but again, he's coming off the bench, but probably will still play a lot. In the regular season, I'm sure he'll help, right? I'm sure there will be, games where, like, they'll win, and part of that's gonna be because of, his contributions, mainly on the offensive end, you know? We'll see, because again, I think with the signing, that also gives Darvin Ham some other tools to work with, right? So it'll be interesting to kind of see what he can do with that, right? Because he
Yeah.
kind of, because I think he did a pretty solid job, from the deadline onwards, kind of like figuring out what he had, because he kind of had to do it on the fly. But now he's got a whole, training camp and, preseason and then regular season, and, to kind of work out things and see what works and what doesn't. I think he's going to have to change some stuff up because I think some of the things like that he did last year as a coach I don't think will necessarily work as well with this roster because it's a different roster compared to last year,
Yeah.
right? Like last year's roster was very small. For most of the season, even after they got guys in the deadline, right? They were only really playing like one center in AD, and then other guys who aren't really centers like Gabriel or even like LeBron or Rui, right?
Yeah.
Like but now you have other bigs that you can put out there. Um, you have a lot more wings to work with, right? So I do think it's an upgrade. I'm just curious to see like, what he does, right, for the Lakers. Cause again, like, it was just kind of funny because I remember, like a thing about, the idea of like, I think an executive was saying like, if LeBron can make this work, right, then he's pretty much the greatest of all time. I guess kind of like to just they were kind of just like sort of hyperbole stating like, yeah, this guy's been a problem for a lot of other teams. And
Right.
I think we heard a thing about like one of, some Laker with like, a high level of
Yeah, I remember this. Yeah.
didn't really want Christian Wood. That was from Laker Nation, I think. We don't know which Laker it was, right? But probably not many that really to choose from because
It's
I
Braun
don't
and AD, bro. It's
I
down to
don't think
those two guys.
yeah, I don't think it'd be that many players with like input on the roster. Maybe it's D'Angelo Russell. I don't know. It
Yeah,
could
maybe
be.
it's AR.
Yeah, maybe it's him, or maybe it's even like Max Christie. I don't know, but regardless, I'm cool with it. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like I'm not against it at all, and I think that he will help. It's just a matter of again, like can they maximize what he does well, and can they minimize what he doesn't do well? Right? That's kind of the basic thing for a lot of these type of signings, right? But again, like for a minimum contract, as like the 14th roster spot, you could do a lot worse. I think.
Oh yeah, 100%. I like the signing. So, like I said, I think it's a win-win. So, happy for him and I hope, the Lakers do maximize his talent.
Yeah. So, now moving on, according to rumors going around, Blazers may open camp with Damian Lillard. So, this is kind of interesting because, it kind of in a way, like you mentioned, ties in with the Christian Wood. We also forgot to mention Danny Green, he went to
Yeah.
Philly. Like I said, I don't think that's really like too significant of a signing.
Not really. I don't even think he's probably going to play a lot, but hey.
I guess he's got some ties with guys on the roster, but he didn't really do a whole lot for Cleveland. when they got him in the buyout market. I like Danny Green a lot, but I think he's probably closer, to probably just being like an end of the rotation, more like locker room type of
Yeah,
guy.
I agree.
Do- And I do think Philly might need some help in that locker room, but we'll see. Um, but regardless, yeah. So according to I guess ESPN, right? The Blazers, so far have not been able to find a suitable trade. So they might start training camp, with Damian Lillard. They're prepared to do that. So it'll be, it'll be kind of intriguing to see, what goes on, there. I'm assuming, at this point, it's kind of funny because with Christian Wood, we mentioned like, some of these guys were waiting on the Lillard deal, maybe Harden deal, but that never happened. And, at a certain point, these guys can't keep waiting. They're going to have to eventually, make a decision and go somewhere.
Right.
Maybe that suggests that, like, yeah, we might be at a point where a trade might not happen, or if it does happen, it may not happen until down the line. Because, like I said, I think Portland ideally would prefer to see, like, let's wait it out. Let's see if, like, somebody else comes to the table. But, so far it doesn't seem like anybody's coming to the table. And I guess they're just, and I guess, kind of understandably so, they don't really like what Miami's offering right now. Because,
Right.
again, if you're Miami, why would you give up a ton to get Lillard when you're the only team so far that's got, legitimate interest in him? And then if you're Portland, why would you want to trade Lillard for, basically, 10, 5 cents on the dollar, right?
Right.
But it's a weird situation to be a part of. But, at a certain point, right, like, something's going to have to give, right? Like either, the trade request is going to have to be like pulled back, or maybe like, he might have to be like, oh, well, I'll be okay with going to this team. Or, Portland is going to have to, do something else. So, we'll see. But, for now,
Oh, saga continues, man.
yeah, the saga continues. And again, like, we are at a funny point because we've been kind of used to guys just getting traded whenever trade requests happen, but we could we might be getting close to a point where maybe like these guys, maybe they're the first guys that don't get their way and maybe they just end up staying. Like I said, I don't think it makes a lot of sense for Portland. We talked about it, in the previous episode, right, with Portland's roster. Like, I just don't think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, to keep him
I think,
around now.
yeah, like I'd rather them just kind of like get on with it, get it done, so you can, facilitate a rebuild. But again, also understand Portland not wanting to just, take like a terrible deal.
Sure. And it's like I think you touched on a great point. People are definitely forgetting that this isn't like a trade demand or anything like that. It's like the Trailblazers don't necessarily and are not obligated to 100% follow through and find Damian Lillard a new team, but like you said, it doesn't really make sense to keep him around, but it's a request, it's not like he had a no trade clause like Bradley Beal or something like that. So, they can dish him out wherever they want to. It's just interesting to me that no team is biting right now. So it wouldn't surprise me if like, closer to the deadline, Lillard's playing like really good basketball, then somebody just makes a move for him.
Yeah. So I guess, now, to kind of wrap up, right? We got, a couple things. So we got Team USA, right? So the stage is set. They are part of the Final Four,
Of
right? They
course.
will be taking on Germany. Obviously, I know everybody went into a panic, last week or whatever, I guess, over, them losing to Lithuania,
Yeah.
right? Obviously, it was kind of a rough situation, right? It was a very big team. And a lot of guys didn't play well, right? Like Austin Reeves didn't play well. Jaron Jackson Jr. didn't play well. Um, but, regardless, they bounced back, right? They blew out the next team they played. So I mean, now the stage has kind of been set. They're going against Germany, right? Germany's been pretty good in the tournament, right? They
Very
just
good.
had, a, I guess a very close win, right? I believe against what was it, Latvia, right?
Yeah.
Because yeah, because like Davis Bertans, right, had a chance to win the game at the buzzer. Took
Yeah.
like a big time transition three, but it didn't go in.
Yeah.
Uh, Germany, right? They were able to withstand, a game from Dennis Schroeder in which he shot 4 for 26,
Yeah.
right? Which I haven't really seen that before.
Bro was
Um,
playing my career out here, man.
when like your best player basically, or one of your best players, right? Has probably one of the. I think he even said on his Instagram, right? He had like his worst game as a basketball player.
Yeah.
And they still won, right?
Right.
And like for the most part, he's played really well for them. But they're gonna have their hands full against the U.S. obviously because the U.S. has got a lot of really good players on it.
Yeah.
Um, but it is kind of intriguing because again, like this Team USA roster, I think has been really cool.
Me too.
Just because again,
Yeah.
like, it's not the quote unquote best players for the U.S., but it's got a lot of players that seem like they fit well together. There are some lineups that I think are a lot better than others, right? Like the lineup that they start with isn't quite as good as the lineup they tend to close with, right? Like they start with Brunson and Ingram, but they usually close with Halliburton and Reeves.
Yes.
But again, there's a lot of connecting pieces, so there's a lot to like. So I expect them, to take care of business and probably, go all the way. I think,
Yeah,
not
I
to.
expect them to go all the way and win it. That's just my expectation because I think we're not like leaps and bounds better than these guys, but I think overall our team is put together a little bit better than the rest of the entire world. But that could just be me.
Depends, because again, Lithuania could be a problem just because of the size. But
Yeah.
we'll see. Again, like so far, I think there's a lot to like, about
Yes.
the.
Yes.
And then finally, we had the G League Ignite, right? We had, some young guys play for the roster, so these are like some guys, that are, gonna be,
Yes.
some high level guys, in the next draft, right? Guys like Ron Holland,
Yeah.
right, who had a really strong debut.
He
Um,
might be the number one pick, man.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Matas, he was another guy. What's his last name? Booz something.
Uh, Mataz Buzelius or something like that.
Right, so just cut that part out. Yeah,
It's
Matas.
fine. Mataz Buzelius. Yeah.
Exactly. So he had, his debut along with other guys as well. So there's a lot to like, I think, about a lot of these young guys. Obviously, we don't need to talk a ton about them now, but obviously these will be guys that will be, amongst, the top guys in the draft next year. But um, again, a lot of big athletes,
Yeah.
a lot of versatility, right? That's something that we've kind of seen like from a lot of these young players now is that they're kind of coming in already with some pretty versatile skill sets. Where like, if you go back a little bit, right, some of these guys were a little bit more raw. But now like these guys can come in and do a lot of different things. And again, there's a lot of athletes too, which is, kind of something to think about as well. Um, so, overall, again, the future looks bright, for a lot of these guys. Even with Team USA, we mentioned it. There's a lot of, young talent, right? Obviously, Anthony Edwards, right, has been really impressive, over the course of this entire, World Cup stretch. So there's a lot to like, I think. I think the future of basketball is in some really good hands.
Yeah, I think these guys are gonna carry the torch, uh, you know, proudly and strongly. I think this is a great transition, and it's really cool to see how far basketball has come, where all these guys can take different routes, or even going back to what KJ McDaniel said in his interview. He was talking about everybody runs a different route and just stick to that. And it's really cool to actually see that come to fruition with some of these guys and their storylines as well. So you know, kudos to all the young guys doing their thing. And like you said, I think it's been a great transition, and the NBA is in good hands.
Yeah, I agree. So yeah, that's pretty much it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know what you think, in terms of our take on Detroit in the comments, whether or not you agree or disagree about whether or not they had a really good offseason. Like I said, after this, we're going to start doing two teams,
Yes.
at a time. Cause again, we're getting closer and closer to the start of the regular season. You got a little more than like, I guess like a month and a half or so before it
Yes.
starts, October 24th. So we're going to try to get these teams done, and again, also like open the floor potentially, for like, maybe some other things happen right as we get to the start of the season. But either way, like I said, let us know what you thought. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you Monday.